The rain fell in sheets that October night, each drop hitting the asphalt like bullets of ice that soaked through my jacket and left me shivering on the shoulder of Highway 42. My car had broken down 3 miles from the nearest town, the engine finally surrendering to years of neglect and my inability to afford proper maintenance. The hazard lights blinked weakly in the darkness, their orange glow barely visible through the curtain of water that made the world seem like it was dissolving around me. I had walked for 20 minutes before finding a spot where my phone showed 2 bars of signal, my feet squelching in shoes that had given up any pretense of being waterproof. The time on my phone read 11:47 p.m. as I scrolled through my contacts, weighing options that all seemed inadequate for my current situation. There was no money for a tow truck. My credit cards were maxed out from months of struggling to keep up with basic expenses, while working 2 part-time jobs that barely covered rent and groceries. My few friends lived too far away, or had their own problems that made asking for help feel like an imposition I couldn't justify. That left family. That left Jake. My finger hovered over his contact information. Jake, with the crown emoji I had added years ago when we were still close, when I still believed that having a successful older brother was something to be proud of rather than a daily reminder of my own failures. Jake lived 23 miles away in his suburban house with the perfect lawn and the BMW in the driveway, the life he had built through ambition, connections, and the kind of confidence that had always come naturally to him, but had somehow skipped me entirely. We hadn't spoken in 3 weeks, not since the argument at Mom's birthday dinner when he had made it clear that he considered my struggles to be the result of poor choices rather than bad luck. But he was family. Brothers were supposed to help each other, especially in emergencies. Despite everything that had gone wrong between us lately, I believed that Jake would come through when it really mattered. I pressed his number and listened to the ringtone while rain dripped from my hair and my teeth chattered in the cold. "Emma?" His voice was thick with sleep and irritation. "Do you know what time it is?" "Jake, I'm sorry to wake you up, but I'm in trouble. My car broke down on Highway 42 near the old Miller farm, and I'm stuck in the rain. Can you please come pick me up?" There was a pause that stretched long enough for me to think the call had dropped, followed by a sound that made my heart sink. Jake was laughing. Not the warm, sympathetic laugh of someone who understood that emergencies happened at inconvenient times, but the harsh, dismissive laugh I had learned to recognize as his response to what he considered my latest display of incompetence. "Jesus, Emma, you're 28 years old. How do you not have AAA? How do you not have emergency money? How do you manage to screw up something as basic as maintaining a car? I know I should have been more prepared, but right now I just need help getting home. Please, Jake. I'm soaked and I'm cold, and there's no one else I can call." Another pause, shorter this time but somehow more devastating. "You know what, Em? I'm tired of being your backup plan every time you make poor life choices. I'm tired of you calling me to fix problems that you should have avoided in the first place. You want to know the truth? You're not even worth the gas it would take to drive out there." The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to cause maximum damage. Not worth the gas. 23 miles of fuel that probably cost less than $15. And Jake, who spent more than that on a single cup of coffee at the artisanal cafe near his office, considered me unworthy of that investment. My hands were shaking, partly from cold, but mostly from a rage so pure and sudden that it felt like electricity coursing through my veins. Without thinking, without planning, I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the record button, capturing the silence that followed his cruel declaration. "Jake," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside my chest. "What did you just say to me?" "I said you're not worth the gas, Emma. You're not worth the time. You're not worth the inconvenience. And you're certainly not worth losing sleep over. Figure it out yourself. You're a grown woman. Act like one." The recording captured every word, every inflection of contempt, every casual cruelty that he delivered with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his own superiority. "I hope you remember saying that," I told him before ending the call. As I stood in the rain with his words echoing in my head and his voice preserved on my phone, I made a promise that would define everything that came next. Jake was going to face consequences for his cruelty, and he was going to face them in front of everyone who had spent years believing that he was the good son, the successful brother, the family member who had earned respect and admiration. The family gathering was 6 days away. 6 days to plan exactly how I would make Jake understand what it felt like to be humiliated by someone who was supposed to love you. Growing up as Jake Morrison's little sister was like living in the shadow of a supernova, everything bright and brilliant and burning, leaving me invisible in the darkness that surrounded his light. From our earliest memories, Jake had been the child who exceeded expectations while I struggled to meet them. the son who made our parents proud while I made them worry, the golden boy who could do no wrong while I seemed incapable of doing anything right. The pattern established itself early and never wavered. Jake walked at 9 months. I walked at 15 months. Each delayed milestone noted with the kind of gentle disappointment that parents try to hide, but children always detect. Jake spoke in full sentences before his 2nd birthday. I struggled with a stutter that lasted until I was 7, earning me speech therapy sessions and concerned glances from relatives who wondered if something was wrong with me. School brought more of the same systematic comparison. Jake was naturally gifted at everything: sports, academics, social interactions that seemed effortless to him, but remained mysterious to me. He was class president 3 years running, captain of the varsity soccer team, valedictorian with scholarship offers to multiple prestigious universities. Teachers remembered him fondly years after he graduated, using him as an example of student excellence for younger classes. "You have big shoes to fill," they would tell me when I entered the same schools, carrying the Morrison name like both a blessing and a curse. "Your brother set quite a high standard." I tried to fill those shoes and failed spectacularly. My grades were decent but not exceptional. My athletic abilities mediocre at best. My social skills adequate for survival, but insufficient for the kind of popularity that had come naturally to Jake. Everything I achieved was measured against his superior accomplishments and found lacking. Our parents never said they loved Jake more than me, but their actions spoke clearly enough. Jake's soccer games were family events that required rearranging schedules and inviting grandparents to witness his excellence. My school plays and art exhibitions were acknowledged with brief appearances and polite applause, before conversations returned to Jake's latest achievement. When Jake got his driver's license, our parents surprised him with a used Honda that was reliable and respected among his peers. When I turned 16, I was given driving lessons and access to the family car when it wasn't needed for more important things. The message was clear. Jake's independence was worth investing in, while mine was a convenience that could be accommodated when it didn't conflict with family priorities. College planning revealed the full extent of the disparity in our perceived potential. Jake's applications to elite universities were family projects that involved everyone's input and support. Our parents hired an expensive consultant to help with his essays, paid for test preparation courses, and visited campuses with him to ensure he made the best possible choice. My college applications were my own responsibility. "You're more practical than Jake," Mom explained when I asked about getting similar support. "You'll figure out what works best for your situation." What worked best for my situation was the local state university, which I attended while living at home to save money that our family had decided to invest in Jake's more promising future. The financial inequality was stark, but never acknowledged directly. Jake's college expenses were covered completely: tuition, room, board, spending money, and a car upgrade so he could drive to his prestigious university in appropriate style. My education was funded through student loans, part-time work, and the understanding that I should be grateful for any family support I received. Investment in excellence, Dad called it when relatives commented on the obvious favoritism. Jake has opportunities that could benefit the whole family eventually. Emma is more self-sufficient. She doesn't need as much help to succeed. Self-sufficient became the code word for less worthy of investment. While Jake was encouraged to pursue internships and networking opportunities that required financial support, I was expected to work retail jobs and pay my own way through experiences that were considered character building rather than career advancing. The pattern continued after college. Jake landed a position at a consulting firm through connections he had made during his prestigious education, while I struggled through a series of temporary jobs and contract work that never quite led to the kind of career stability that would make our parents proud. His success was celebrated as evidence of good planning and family values. My struggles were attributed to a lack of focus and poor decision-making. Jake always knew what he wanted and went after it. Mom would say when friends asked about her children, "Emma is still finding her way, but she's got a good heart." A good heart. The consolation prize for the child who hadn't managed to achieve anything worth celebrating. Family gatherings became performances where Jake's accomplishments were highlighted, while my life was politely overlooked or dismissed with brief, uncomfortable summaries. He would arrive in expensive clothes and talk about business deals and vacation plans, while I made excuses for my secondhand outfits and worked extra shifts to afford the gas money to attend family events. The worst part wasn't the inequality itself. It was the way Jake had internalized our parents' differential treatment and begun to see me through their eyes. He genuinely believed that his success proved his superior worth, and that my struggles proved that I deserved less consideration and support. That belief had shaped every interaction we'd had as adults. leading inevitably to the night when he decided I wasn't worth the cost of gasoline and the family gathering where his cruelty would finally be exposed. The deterioration of my relationship with Jake hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow erosion of respect and affection, carved away by years of small cruelties and casual dismissals that had finally worn through whatever bond we had once shared as children. But the breaking point came 3 months before the night I stood stranded in the rain, during what should have been a celebration, but became instead the moment I realized my brother saw me as a burden rather than family. It was Mom's 60th birthday, and I had spent weeks planning a surprise party that would bring together relatives and friends she hadn't seen in years. I had coordinated schedules, booked the restaurant, arranged decorations, and personally called 37 people to organize a celebration that would make her feel loved and appreciated. The planning had required juggling my work schedule, using vacation days I couldn't afford to lose, and spending money I didn't have on flowers, a custom cake, and a photo slideshow that took me hours to create. Jake arrived 20 minutes late, his BMW pulling into the restaurant parking lot, just as I was frantically texting him to ask where he was. He stepped out of his car wearing a suit that cost more than my monthly rent, carrying a gift bag from an expensive department store, and showing no awareness that dozens of people had been waiting for him to begin the surprise. "Sorry I'm late," he said casually, straightening his tie. "Conference call with a client in London ran over. You know how it is." I didn't know how it was, actually. My part-time jobs didn't involve international clients or conference calls important enough to delay family obligations, but I bit my tongue and led him into the restaurant where our mother was waiting with friends and family who had rearranged their own schedules to accommodate the party I had organized. The celebration itself was everything I had hoped it would be. Mom cried happy tears when everyone yelled, "Surprise!" She loved the decorations, the cake, and especially the photo slideshow that chronicled 60 years of memories and relationships. Friends told stories, relatives shared favorite memories, and everyone agreed it was exactly the kind of meaningful celebration that Mom deserved. But when people began asking who had organized the wonderful party, Jake stepped forward with the confident smile that had charmed teachers, employers, and family members throughout his life. "It was a team effort," he said, accepting congratulations with gracious modesty. "Emma helped with some of the details, but I handled the big picture planning and coordination." The lie was so casual, so smoothly delivered, that several relatives nodded approvingly and thanked Jake for his thoughtfulness in organizing such a beautiful celebration. I stood frozen in the corner, watching my brother take credit for weeks of my work while positioning me as his assistant, rather than the primary planner. "Jake did such a wonderful job," Aunt Linda told me later in the evening. "It's so nice to see him taking care of family like this. You're lucky to have such a thoughtful big brother." Lucky. I was lucky to have a brother who would steal credit for my efforts and rewrite history to make himself look generous and responsible. The confrontation came later that week when I called Jake to ask why he had lied about organizing Mom's party. "I didn't lie," he said, his tone suggesting I was being unreasonable. "I contributed to the planning process and helped make sure everything went smoothly." "Jake, you showed up late and handed Mom a gift you probably bought on the way to the restaurant. I spent 3 weeks organizing every detail of that party. Look, Emma, you did some nice work on the logistics, but I was the one who made sure the family understood how important this celebration was. I was the one who set the tone and made sure people knew this was a significant event." The gaslighting was so complete, so confident, that I almost began to doubt my own memories of frantically coordinating schedules and spending money I couldn't afford to create a celebration that Jake had nearly missed entirely. "You took credit for my work," I said simply. "I acknowledged your contribution. But let's be honest. If I hadn't been there to provide leadership and make sure everything had the right level of sophistication, it would have been a nice little get-together instead of the elegant celebration Mom deserved. Leadership, sophistication. Jake had transformed my hard work into his inspired guidance, my financial sacrifice into his elevated standards, my love for our mother into his superior understanding of what she deserved. That was the moment I understood that Jake saw me not as an equal, but as support staff for his starring role in our family's narrative. I was the worker bee who handled details while he was the visionary who made everything meaningful. I was disposable, replaceable, and ultimately unworthy of credit for my own contributions. Over the following months, our interactions became increasingly strained as I struggled to accept this new understanding of our relationship. Jake seemed genuinely puzzled by my coolness, unable to comprehend why I might be hurt by his casual appropriation of my efforts. The distance between us grew wider with each family event, where he effortlessly commanded attention while I faded into the background. Each conversation where he dismissed my struggles as self-inflicted, while celebrating his successes as inevitable. each moment when I realized that the brother I had once admired had become someone who saw me as an inconvenience rather than a person worthy of basic respect. By the time my car broke down on Highway 42, our relationship had already fractured beyond repair. His refusal to help me that night wasn't the cause of our estrangement. It was the symptom of a deeper cruelty that I was finally ready to expose. The evening that left me stranded in the rain had begun with hope, the kind of fragile optimism that comes from believing you might finally be turning a corner in your life, that the next opportunity might be the one that changes everything. I had been driving to Millfield, a town 40 miles from home, for a job interview that represented everything I'd been working toward: stable employment, decent pay, and the possibility of financial security that had eluded me for years. The position was assistant manager at a small marketing firm that specialized in helping local businesses develop their online presence. It wasn't glamorous work, but it offered a full-time salary, health benefits, and growth potential that could lift me out of the paycheck-to-paycheck existence that had defined my adult life. The owner, Margaret Chen, had seemed genuinely impressed with my portfolio during our phone interview and had asked me to drive out for a face-to-face meeting that could lead to an immediate job offer. I had spent the previous week preparing for this interview with the kind of meticulous attention that had become second nature after years of competing for opportunities while being consistently overlooked. I researched the company's clients, studied their marketing strategies, and prepared specific suggestions for improvements that demonstrated both my knowledge and my enthusiasm for the work. My interview outfit was carefully chosen from the limited selection of professional clothes I could afford: a navy blazer from a discount store, paired with a white shirt I had ironed 3 times to ensure it was perfect. I had printed multiple copies of my resume on good paper, prepared a presentation folder with examples of my best work, and practiced my answers to likely questions until I felt confident and ready. The drive to Millfield took 45 minutes through rural highways lined with farms and forests that looked peaceful in the late afternoon sunlight. I arrived early and spent 10 minutes in the parking lot reviewing my notes and giving myself the kind of pep talk that had gotten me through previous disappointments. This was my chance. I deserved this opportunity. I was going to impress Margaret Chen and finally land the job that would change my circumstances. The interview exceeded my expectations. Margaret was warm, intelligent, and clearly looking for someone who understood both the technical aspects of digital marketing and the personal service that small businesses needed. We discussed strategies for improving client retention, expanding service offerings, and building long-term relationships that benefited everyone involved. "I have to tell you, Emma," Margaret said as the interview concluded, "you're exactly what we've been looking for. Your experience with social media management is impressive, and your ideas for improving our client communication systems show real strategic thinking." She offered me the position on the spot: assistant manager with a starting salary of $48,000 annually, health insurance, 2 weeks paid vacation, and a 6-month performance review that could lead to additional responsibilities and compensation. It was more money than I had ever made in a steady job, enough to finally achieve the financial stability that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. I accepted immediately, barely containing my excitement as we discussed start dates and initial projects. Margaret handed me a packet of new employee paperwork to complete over the weekend and asked me to return on Monday for my first day. I walked to my car, feeling lighter than I had in months, finally able to imagine a future where I wasn't constantly worried about rent money and grocery budgets. The Honda started normally and ran fine for the first 20 miles of the drive home. But somewhere between Millfield and the highway junction near the old Miller farm, the engine began making concerning sounds, a rhythmic knocking that grew louder and more irregular as I pressed on the gas pedal. I had been ignoring warning signs for weeks because I couldn't afford to address them. The oil light had been coming on intermittently, the engine had been running rough during cold starts, and there had been occasional stalling that I attributed to bad gas or minor maintenance issues that I would handle when I could afford a proper tune-up. But cars don't wait for convenient timing to break down, and mine chose the worst possible moment to finally surrender to months of neglect and deferred maintenance. The engine seized completely about 3 miles from the nearest town, leaving me coasting to the shoulder of Highway 42 as warning lights illuminated my dashboard like a Christmas tree. I sat in the sudden silence, listening to rain begin pattering against the windshield and feeling the euphoria from my successful interview drain away as quickly as it had arrived. The job offer in my purse represented hope and opportunity, but it was meaningless if I couldn't get home safely or figure out how to afford the car repairs that would allow me to actually start work on Monday. My phone showed 2 bars of signal and a battery at 37%. I had approximately $2 in cash and credit cards that were maxed out from months of relying on them for basic expenses. The towing and repair costs for a seized engine would easily exceed $1,000, money that I didn't have and couldn't access without help from someone who cared enough to invest in my ability to get back on my feet. That someone should have been Jake. Despite everything that had gone wrong between us lately, he was still my brother, still family, still someone who had benefited from the same parents and upbringing that should have instilled values about helping people you love when they need it most. Instead, he became the person who looked at my emergency and decided I wasn't worth the cost of gasoline, setting in motion events that would destroy whatever remained of our relationship and expose him to consequences he never saw coming. The walk back to town took 47 minutes through rain that had progressed from gentle shower to serious storm, soaking through every layer of clothing I wore until I was shivering, not just from cold, but from the kind of bone-deep chill that comes from being genuinely afraid about your immediate future. My phone battery had dropped to 18% by the time I found shelter under the awning of a closed gas station, and Jake's cruel words were still echoing in my head with perfect, devastating clarity. "You're not even worth the gas." I played the recording back 3 times, listening to my brother's voice deliver that sentence with casual contempt, as if my worth as a human being could be measured in dollars and cents and found wanting. Each playback made me angrier and more determined to ensure that his words would have consequences beyond leaving me stranded and humiliated. The recording was clear, despite the ambient noise of rain and passing cars. Jake's voice was unmistakable, his words unambiguous, his tone exactly as dismissive and cruel as I remembered. But more than that, the recording captured something that would be devastating when played for our family. The sound of someone who truly believed that his comfort and convenience were more important than his sister's safety and well-being. I saved the file to my phone's cloud storage and sent copies to 3 different email accounts, ensuring that the evidence would be preserved even if something happened to my device. Then I called a taxi service that charged $38 to drive me home, money I couldn't afford to spend, but had no choice but to put on my credit card. The taxi driver was a middle-aged man named Carlos, who seemed genuinely concerned about finding a young woman alone on the highway at midnight during a storm. "Your car break down?" he asked, adjusting his rearview mirror to make eye contact. "Engine died," I explained, not mentioning the family drama that had left me walking in the rain instead of being safely collected by someone who claimed to care about me. "That's rough. You got someone who can help you get it towed and fixed?" The question hurt more than it should have. "I'm working on it," I said, which was true enough even if my plan for addressing the situation involved public humiliation rather than brotherly support. Carlos drove carefully through the storm and refused to accept a tip when we reached my apartment complex. "You look like you've had enough bad luck for one night," he said kindly. "Things will get better." I wanted to believe him, but as I climbed the stairs to my studio apartment and changed into dry clothes, I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my life. The job offer that had seemed like salvation a few hours earlier now felt impossible to accept. How could I start work on Monday if I couldn't afford to get my car repaired? How could I maintain employment that required reliable transportation when I was too poor to address basic mechanical problems? But worse than the practical concerns was the emotional devastation of Jake's rejection. He had reduced our lifelong relationship to a cost-benefit analysis and decided I wasn't worth a small financial investment, even in an emergency that threatened my safety and my future prospects. The apartment felt smaller than usual as I paced between the kitchenette and the Murphy bed, replaying not just that night's phone call, but months and years of interactions, where Jake had made it clear that he considered himself superior to me in every meaningful way. The pattern had been building toward this moment of absolute rejection, and I had been too hopeful, or too naive to see it coming. I spent the remainder of the night planning exactly how I would use the recording to hold Jake accountable for his cruelty. Our family's monthly dinner was scheduled for the following Sunday at Mom and Dad's house, the same gathering where Jake had taken credit for organizing Mom's birthday party, where he regularly basked in parental approval while I remained largely invisible. This time, he would be the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. I researched the legal implications of recording phone calls without consent, discovering that in our state, only one party needed to be aware that a conversation was being recorded. The audio I had captured was completely legal and admissible as evidence of Jake's character and his treatment of family members. More importantly, I began documenting other instances of Jake's cruelty and selfishness that our parents had either ignored or excused over the years. His pattern of taking credit for other people's work, his dismissive treatment of anyone he considered beneath his social status, his casual cruelty toward service workers and family members who couldn't benefit his career. I created a comprehensive timeline of Jake's behavior that showed a consistent pattern of treating people as disposable when they couldn't serve his interests. The phone recording would be the centerpiece, but I wanted our family to understand that his refusal to help me wasn't an isolated incident. It was the logical culmination of years of systematic selfishness that they had chosen to overlook. By dawn, I had a plan that would expose Jake's true character to the people whose opinions he valued most. The golden child who had spent his life accumulating praise and admiration was about to discover what it felt like to be judged harshly by the family he had taken for granted. The recording on my phone contained the evidence that would destroy Jake's carefully constructed image and force our parents to confront the reality of who their favorite son had become. Sunday dinner was 6 days away. 6 days to prepare for the moment when Jake would finally face consequences for treating his sister as worthless. Sunday arrived with the kind of crisp October weather that made our parents' house look like a postcard. The maple trees in their front yard dressed in brilliant oranges and reds that caught the afternoon sunlight and cast dancing shadows across the walkway I had traversed thousands of times throughout my childhood. But as I approached the front door carrying a bottle of wine I couldn't afford, and the recorded evidence of Jake's cruelty on my phone, the familiar house felt like foreign territory where I was about to detonate a bomb that would change everything forever. Mom greeted me with her usual warm hug and the concerned expression she wore whenever she noticed I looked tired or stressed, which had been increasingly often over the past few months, as my financial situation deteriorated and my relationship with Jake grew more strained. "Emma, sweetheart, you look thin. Are you eating enough?" she asked, the way mothers do when they suspect their children are struggling but don't know how to offer help without seeming intrusive. "I'm fine, Mom. Just been busy with work." The lie came easily, partly because I had been practicing it for months, and partly because the alternative, admitting that I sometimes skipped meals to save money, would have led to conversations I wasn't ready to have. Dad was in his usual spot in the living room, watching a football game with the volume turned down while he reviewed case files from his law practice. He looked up when I entered and gave me the kind of smile that suggested he was genuinely happy to see me, but slightly confused about what to say, the way he had been treating me since I graduated college and failed to immediately launch a successful career. "How's the job search going?" he asked, which was his standard conversation starter when he couldn't think of anything else to discuss with his chronically underemployed daughter. "I actually got an offer this week," I said, which was technically true, even though my inability to get my car repaired made accepting the position practically impossible. "Marketing firm in Millfield. Good salary and benefits." "That's wonderful," Mom called from the kitchen, where she was preparing the elaborate Sunday dinner that brought our family together once a month for what was supposed to be quality time, but often felt more like a performance where everyone pretended we were closer and happier than we actually were. Jake arrived 15 minutes late, as had become his habit, sweeping through the front door with the kind of confident energy that filled whatever space he occupied and drew attention like a magnet. He was wearing a casual outfit that probably cost more than I made in a week: designer jeans, an expensive sweater, and leather shoes that looked like they had never touched anything rougher than office carpet. "Sorry I'm late," he announced, kissing Mom on the cheek and clapping Dad on the shoulder with the easy affection of someone who had never doubted his welcome in any situation. "Client emergency. You know how it is." I knew how it was, actually. It was Jake prioritizing his own schedule over family commitments, while expecting everyone else to accommodate his convenience. It was the same pattern that had led him to refuse help when I was stranded in the rain, dressed up as professional responsibility instead of personal selfishness. "Emma was just telling us about a job offer she received," Mom said, serving appetizers that she had probably spent hours preparing despite working full-time herself. "Marketing firm with good salary and benefits." Jake looked at me with what might have been genuine interest, or might have been polite curiosity. It had become increasingly difficult to distinguish between his authentic emotions and his social performance skills. "That's great news," he said, settling into the armchair that had been informally designated as his spot during family gatherings. "What kind of marketing? Are they a real firm, or one of those social media consulting operations?" The question contained just enough subtle condescension to remind everyone that Jake worked for a prestigious consulting company, while I was apparently considering employment with lesser organizations that might not meet his standards for legitimate business operations. "Digital marketing for small businesses," I replied evenly. "Real firm with established clients and growth potential." "Well, that's something," Jake said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Everyone has to start somewhere. Everyone has to start somewhere." As if I hadn't been starting somewhere for the past 6 years. As if this job opportunity was a first step, rather than a potential rescue from years of underemployment and financial instability. Dinner conversation followed familiar patterns. Jake dominated discussion with stories about his professional successes and important clients, while Mom and Dad listened with the kind of rapt attention usually reserved for entertainment celebrities or visiting dignitaries. I contributed occasional comments and answered direct questions, but mostly I watched Jake perform the role of successful son, while our parents basked in reflected glory. The Henderson account is expanding their contract by 40%, Jake was saying as Mom served dessert. They specifically requested that I handle the additional work personally. I'm probably looking at another bonus this quarter. Another bonus. Jake discussed money the way other people discussed weather, casually mentioning amounts that represented months of my income, as if they were routine developments rather than extraordinary privileges. As the evening wound toward its usual conclusion, I realized this was probably the last normal family dinner we would ever have. Within the next hour, I was going to destroy Jake's image and force our parents to confront the reality of who their golden child had become. The recording on my phone felt like a loaded weapon, and I was finally ready to pull the trigger. The transition from dinner to the living room happened with the lazy comfort of family routine, everyone finding their familiar spots while Mom cleared dishes and Dad turned up the volume on the evening news. Jake settled into his armchair with a satisfied expression, probably anticipating another successful family performance where his accomplishments were celebrated, and his status as the favored child was reinforced through subtle and not-so-subtle comparisons. I remained standing near the entertainment center, my phone clutched in my hand like a talisman, my heart beating so hard that I worried everyone could hear it. The moment I had been planning for 6 days was finally here, and the weight of what I was about to do felt simultaneously justified and terrifying. "Actually," I said, my voice cutting through the comfortable murmur of post-dinner conversation, "before everyone gets too settled, I have something I'd like to share with the family." Mom looked up from her coffee with mild interest, probably expecting an announcement about the new job or perhaps some other personal news that would provide a pleasant conclusion to our evening together. Dad muted the television and turned his attention toward me with the polite focus he used for family matters that required his consideration. Jake glanced at his phone, probably checking messages, or calculating how much longer he needed to stay before he could make his usual gracious exit to return to his more important life. He had no idea that he was about to become the sole focus of everyone's attention in ways he had never experienced. "As you know," I began, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "My car broke down this past Monday night while I was driving home from my job interview in Millfield. I found myself stranded on Highway 42 around midnight in the middle of a storm with no way to get home safely." The room grew quieter as my family began to sense that this was not going to be a typical Emma story about minor inconveniences and small setbacks. Mom's expression shifted from mild interest to concern, and even Jake looked up from his phone with what might have been genuine attention. I was soaked, I was cold, I was scared, and I was alone on a deserted road with no money for a tow truck and no other options for getting help. I paused, looking directly at Jake, so I called my big brother, the person who should have been there for me when I needed help the most. Jake's face didn't change, but I noticed his posture stiffen slightly as he realized where this narrative was heading. I explained the situation and asked Jake to come pick me up. It would have been a 46-mile round trip, probably 45 minutes of his time, and less than $20 in gas. I pulled out my phone and held it up so everyone could see it. I recorded our conversation because I wanted to preserve his exact words for moments just like this one. "Emma," Jake said quickly, his voice carrying a warning tone that suggested I should reconsider whatever I was planning to do. "I don't think this is necessary. We can discuss whatever issues you have privately." "Oh, but I think our parents should hear this," I replied, pressing the play button before he could object further. "I think they should understand exactly who their golden son really is when nobody's watching." Jake's voice filled the living room with crystal clarity, every word of our conversation preserved in perfect digital reproduction. My family listened in stunned silence as the recording played, hearing first my desperate request for help, then Jake's laughter, then his casual cruelty delivered with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his own superiority. "You know what, Em? I'm tired of being your backup plan every time you make poor life choices. I'm tired of you calling me to fix problems that you should have avoided in the first place. You want to know the truth? You're not even worth the gas it would take to drive out there." The silence that followed was profound and terrible, the kind of quiet that occurs when people are trying to process information that contradicts everything they thought they knew about someone they love. Mom's hand had moved to her mouth in an unconscious gesture of shock, while Dad's expression had shifted from mild attention to something approaching horror. Jake sat frozen in his armchair, his face cycling through emotions. surprise, anger, panic, and what might have been the first genuine shame I had ever seen him display. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, apparently unable to find words that could explain or justify what everyone had just heard. "Jake," Mom said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "please tell me that wasn't really you on that recording." He looked at her with an expression I had never seen before, not the confident smile or the charming deflection he used to navigate difficult situations, but something raw and desperate that suggested he understood his carefully constructed image was crumbling in real time. "Mom, you don't understand the context," he began, but his voice lacked the conviction that usually characterized his explanations and excuses. "Emma has been having problems for years, and I've been helping her constantly. I was tired and frustrated, and I said something I shouldn't have said. You said I wasn't worth the gas money," I stated simply. "You left your sister stranded on a highway at midnight because $20 was too much to spend on my safety." The silence that followed was brutal, and Jake couldn't even lift his head to meet anyone's eyes. The aftermath of the recording was like watching a controlled demolition in slow motion. 30 years of carefully constructed family dynamics collapsing as the truth about Jake's character became impossible to ignore or explain away. He sat in his armchair with his head bowed, his shoulders curved inward, as if he were trying to make himself smaller, while our parents stared at him with expressions of shock and growing disappointment. Mom was crying silently, tears streaming down her cheeks as she struggled to reconcile the son she had raised with the voice on the recording that had dismissed his sister's safety with casual cruelty. She kept shaking her head as if she could somehow deny what she had heard, as if repetition might change the reality of Jake's words. 30 years, she whispered, speaking to no one in particular. 30 years of teaching you about family responsibility and caring for people who need help, and this is what you do when your sister needs you most? Dad had gone very still, his lawyer's mind probably cataloging the evidence and reaching conclusions about character and culpability that he didn't want to acknowledge. He looked at Jake with the kind of clinical assessment usually reserved for opposing counsel or defendants whose behavior had revealed moral failings that couldn't be defended. "Explain it," Dad said quietly, his voice carrying the authority that had made him successful in courtrooms and family discussions throughout my childhood. "Explain how you could leave your sister stranded on a highway at midnight because you didn't want to spend money on gasoline." Jake finally raised his head, and I was surprised to see that he was crying. Not the theatrical tears of someone seeking sympathy, but the genuine distress of a person whose world was falling apart in real time. This was not part of his plan, not a situation he could manage through charm and deflection. "I was tired," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I'd had a long day, and I was already asleep when Emma called. I wasn't thinking clearly, and I said things I didn't mean." "You meant them," I said firmly. "You've been treating me like I'm worthless for years. This was just the first time you said it clearly enough to document." "Emma, that's not true. I love you. You're my sister. You love the idea of having a sister who makes you look good by comparison. You love having someone around who struggles so that your success seems more impressive. But you don't love me as a person. Because if you did, you never could have left me alone on that road." Mom stood up abruptly, walking to the window with her back to all of us, her shoulders shaking with sobs she was trying to contain. I had never seen her this upset, not even during her mother's funeral, or Dad's heart attack scare 3 years ago. "All those times," she said without turning around, "all those times we praised you for being responsible and successful and caring about family. All those times we held you up as an example for Emma to follow. We were wrong about everything, weren't we?" Jake looked desperately between our parents, perhaps finally understanding that his image as the golden child was being permanently destroyed by his own recorded words. "Mom, please, you have to understand that I've been under a lot of pressure lately. Work has been demanding, and I've been stressed about performance reviews and client expectations. I wasn't thinking clearly when Emma called." "Don't blame work," Dad said sharply. "Don't blame stress. You made a conscious decision to prioritize your comfort over your sister's safety, and you did it with complete indifference to the consequences." I watched Jake's usual composure continue to crumble, as he realized that his parents, the people whose approval had shaped his entire identity, were looking at him with disappointment and genuine anger for perhaps the first time in his life. "I can fix this," Jake said desperately. "I can make it right. Emma, I'll pay for your car repairs. I'll help you get to your new job. I'll do whatever it takes to show you that I'm sorry." "Now you want to help," I replied. "Now that everyone knows who you really are, you're ready to spend money on me. But where was this generosity when I actually needed it?" "I made a mistake," Jake pleaded. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Can't you forgive me? Can't we move past this? The question hung in the air like smoke, and I realized that Jake still didn't understand the full magnitude of what had been revealed. He thought this was about one cruel comment, one moment of poor judgment that could be fixed with an apology and some financial assistance. He didn't understand that the recording had exposed something deeper, a fundamental lack of empathy and consideration that had shaped our relationship for years and would continue to shape it regardless of whatever amends he might attempt to make. Jake, I said quietly, this isn't about forgiveness. This is about truth. For 30 years, our family has operated under the assumption that you're a good person who deserves respect and admiration. Now we all know that assumption was wrong. The silence that followed was absolute, and Jake still couldn't lift his head to meet anyone's eyes. The golden child had fallen, and there was no way back to the pedestal he had occupied for so long. But I wasn't finished revealing truths. The recording was just the beginning of what our family needed to understand about the person they had been celebrating while ignoring his victims. In the devastating silence that followed Jake's failed attempts at explanation, I realized that the moment had come to reveal the deeper truth that would shatter not just his image, but our family's understanding of itself. The recording had exposed his cruelty, but there was something else. Something I had discovered only 2 days earlier that would transform this evening from public humiliation into complete revelation. There's more, I said quietly, pulling out a manila folder I had been carrying with my phone. The recording is just part of what you all need to understand about Jake. Mom turned from the window, her face streaked with tears, but her expression suggesting she was bracing herself for additional devastating news. Dad leaned forward in his chair with the focused attention he brought to crisis situations, while Jake looked up with something approaching panic in his eyes. "Emma, what are you talking about?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I opened the folder and pulled out bank statements, credit card bills, and legal documents that I had spent the weekend organizing into a comprehensive picture of financial fraud and family betrayal. Thursday morning, after I got my car towed to Morrison's garage, Bill Morrison mentioned something interesting, I began, watching Jake's face carefully for his reaction. He said you had been there 6 months ago asking about my car, specifically asking about its mechanical condition and how long it might continue running without major repairs. The color drained from Jake's face so quickly that Mom took a step toward him, probably worried he was having some kind of medical emergency. Bill thought it was sweet that my big brother was looking out for me, maybe planning to help with maintenance costs or arrange for repairs. But that's not why you were asking, was it, Jake? Emma, I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. I placed the bank statements on the coffee table where everyone could see them. These are your credit card records for the past 8 months, which I obtained through a private investigator after I started wondering why you seemed so confident that I would fail to establish any career stability. Dad moved closer to examine the documents, his lawyer's training taking over as he began scanning the financial evidence I had compiled. You've been paying people to sabotage my job applications, I continued, watching Jake's facade crumble completely as he realized the scope of what I had discovered. $1,500 to someone at Morrison Industries to ensure my interview went badly, $2,000 to a recruiter at Davidson & Associates to make sure my application was rejected despite my qualifications. Mom sank into her chair, as if her legs had given out, staring at Jake with horror and disbelief. Jake, please tell me this isn't true. You've been systematically undermining my attempts to find stable employment while positioning yourself as the successful son, whose achievements made my failures more obvious by comparison, I said. Every job interview that went badly, every opportunity that mysteriously disappeared, every setback that made me seem incompetent, you orchestrated it. I placed more documents on the table, emails, payment records, and a private investigator's report that detailed Jake's campaign to ensure I remained financially dependent and professionally unsuccessful. But the worst part isn't the sabotage, I continued, my voice gaining strength as I finally revealed the truth that had been poisoning our family relationships for years. The worst part is that you convinced our parents that my struggles were evidence of my personal failures while your success proved your superior character. Dad was reading through the evidence with growing fury, his face flushed with anger as he began to understand the scope of Jake's deception. You've been paying people to ensure your sister couldn't find decent employment? It's not what it looks like, Jake said desperately, but his protests sounded hollow even to him. Actually, it's exactly what it looks like, I replied. You needed me to fail so that your success seemed more impressive. You needed me to struggle so that you looked generous when you occasionally offered help. You needed me to be the family disappointment, so that you could be the family success story. I pulled out the final document, a recorded conversation between Jake and someone at a staffing agency, discussing ways to ensure that Emma Morrison's applications would be handled with appropriate skepticism about her qualifications and stability. You created a situation where I was grateful for scraps of attention and support because you had systematically ensured that I couldn't achieve independence or success on my own. Mom was crying harder now, not just from disappointment, but from rage as she understood how thoroughly she had been manipulated. You let us blame Emma for her struggles while you were the one causing them? I wanted to help her build character, Jake said weakly, still trying to justify the unjustifiable. I thought if she had to work harder, you wanted to destroy her so you could look better, Dad interrupted, his voice filled with disgust. You've been systematically sabotaging your own sister's life to feed your ego. The golden child who had spent 30 years accumulating praise and admiration was finally revealed as someone who had built his reputation by tearing down the person closest to him. But even this wasn't the worst truth I had to share with my family. The final revelation came not from the documents in my folder, but from Jake himself, a confession that emerged in the wreckage of his destroyed reputation as he realized that lying would only make his situation worse. With his financial records spread across the coffee table and his parents staring at him with expressions of horror and disgust, he finally told the truth about why he had been so determined to keep me dependent and unsuccessful. There's something else you need to know, Jake said, his voice barely audible as he faced the complete collapse of everything he had built his identity around. Something about Emma that I've been managing for years. The room fell silent again, but this time the quiet felt different. Not the stunned silence of people processing shocking information, but the breathless anticipation of family members who sensed they were about to learn something that would change their understanding of everything they thought they knew. "What are you talking about?" Dad demanded, his lawyer's instincts probably warning him that Jake was about to reveal something that would make the evening's previous revelations seem minor by comparison. Jake looked at me with an expression that might have been apology or might have been desperation, then turned to our parents with the kind of defeated honesty that comes from having no remaining options for deception or manipulation. "Emma isn't my biological sister," he said simply. "She's Dad's daughter, but not Mom's. Dad had an affair 28 years ago, and Emma is the result." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of profound quiet that occurs when reality shifts so dramatically that human brains require time to process information that contradicts decades of established truth. Mom's face went completely white, while Dad seemed to age 10 years in the space of a few seconds. "I found out when I was 16, Jake continued, his words coming faster now as if he needed to get the entire confession out before he lost his courage. "I overheard Dad on the phone with Emma's biological mother, discussing child support payments and legal arrangements. I confronted him, and he admitted everything. I felt the blood drain from my own face as I realized that Jake's cruelty hadn't just been about sibling rivalry or professional competition. It had been about family betrayal and secrets that went back to my birth. Dad begged me not to tell Mom because it would destroy the family," Jake said, looking directly at our mother for the first time since the recording had played. He said Emma's biological mother had agreed to give up custody in exchange for financial support, and that adopting Emma was the only way to keep the family together. Mom stood up slowly, moving with the careful precision of someone who was trying not to collapse under the weight of information that was rewriting her understanding of her marriage, her family, and her own life. 28 years, she whispered, staring at Dad with an expression of betrayal so profound that it was painful to witness. 28 years of lies. "Margaret, please let me explain," Dad began, but Mom held up her hand to stop him. "And you," she said, turning toward Jake, "you've known this entire time. You've watched me treat Emma differently, wondering why she seemed so dissimilar to the rest of the family, never understanding that she actually was different. I wanted to protect you," Jake said desperately. "I wanted to protect the family. You wanted to punish Emma for existing," I said, finally understanding the source of hostility I had never been able to explain. "You've spent my entire life making me pay for Dad's mistakes." "I was angry," Jake admitted. "I was 16 years old, and I found out that my father had cheated on my mother, and that I was supposed to pretend his bastard daughter was my real sister." The word hit the room like a physical blow, and Mom actually flinched as if she had been struck. But instead of the shame or hurt Jake had probably expected to see, her expression shifted to something I had never witnessed before. Maternal protectiveness directed entirely at me. "Emma," Mom said, turning toward me with tears streaming down her face, "I am so sorry. I'm sorry for every time I compared you to Jake unfairly. I'm sorry for every time I wondered why you seemed different. I'm sorry for not loving you the way you deserve to be loved." She crossed the room and pulled me into her arms with fierce intensity, holding me tighter than she had since I was a small child. "You are my daughter," she said firmly, speaking to me but looking directly at Jake. "You have been my daughter for 28 years, and you will be my daughter for the rest of my life. Biology doesn't matter. Adoption papers don't matter. What matters is love, and I should have loved you better," I cried then. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally understanding why I had always felt like an outsider in my own family, and why Jake had treated me with such systematic cruelty, despite sharing the same upbringing and values. Jake sat alone in his armchair, watching the family he had tried to preserve through lies and manipulation fragment beyond repair. The golden child who had spent 30 years accumulating praise and admiration had finally succeeded in destroying everything he claimed to value. But as Mom held me and whispered apologies for decades of unintentional coldness, I realized that some truths, even devastating ones, can ultimately heal more than they harm. The family gathering that was supposed to celebrate Jake's continued success had instead exposed him as someone willing to sacrifice his sister's well-being to protect secrets that should never have been kept. And in losing his position as the favored child, he had given me something far more valuable: a mother's unconditional love and the understanding that I had never been the problem in our family dynamic.